It claims J.B. Van Hollen is going to try to redefine, apparently, what counts as a training course and what would qualify a person for a Wisconsin permit. The Journal-Sentinel says a top official with the NRA has sent J.B. Van Hollen a sharply worded letter over how he's interpreting the state's new law allowing people to carry concealed weapons. The letter sent to Van Hollen said that the NRA's primary concern is that his Department of Justice will require training courses for concealed weapons to last at least 4 hours and to include hands-on firearm training. Now, I'll tell you right off the bat here, if this is true, J.B. Van Hollen is adding requirements that the legislature explicitly didn't want to add and explicitly didn't feel were needed. Chris Cox is the executive director of the NRA's Institute for Legislative Action. He says, "We are frankly disappointed by the grudging attitude the Department of Justice has taken toward this law." Then they go on to quote a representative from Sister Bay, a Republican named Gary Bice, who voted for the concealed weapons legislation but said it was entirely reasonable to set a minimum number of hours for training. Otherwise, he says some instructors might not give people the full training they need. And says, in fact, he served as a deputy sheriff in Door County for 11 years. He said he would introduce a bill later this month that would require at least 8 hours of training to get a concealed weapons permit. Well, okay, but that is not what the current bill requires, and J.B. Van Hollen cannot just invent standards on his own. Van Hollen's responsible for writing administrative rules that will implement the law. Scott Walker would have to sign off on those rules, which would also be reviewed by lawmakers. It's the rules that have sparked the ire of the NRA. Cox said lawmakers rejected amendments that would have specified how many hours of training were necessary. Yeah, when the law was written, lawmakers made it clear what they wanted to be sufficient training and what they didn't want. Steve Means, executive and assistant to Van Hollen, says the agency believes requiring a minimum of 4 hours of training is appropriate and that the agency's proposed rules would include that requirement. The department also intends to offer rules that would require training certificates to include signatures of trainers and the date and location of training. That will help prevent fraudulent certificates. Well, nobody's saying that that's a bad idea. Every state in the union that has concealed carry does that. We need to decide how to guard against fraudulent certificates, sure. But as for the accusation here, as for what the base requirements of the course will be, that's not up to Van Hollen to define. The law that passed already laid out the minimum training requirements. We were all on the same page. This is what annoys me. If this is in fact true, and I'll have Jason get a hold of Van Hollen. We'll see if we can try to line them up for tomorrow. We were all on the same page. Lawmakers, NRA lobbyists, the governor, we talk show hosts who were explaining it all to you as this passed. We all spoke in concrete terms. This will be allowed. This will not be. And why were we speaking in concrete terms? Because the lawmakers authoring the bill and the rest of us were clear. We were explicit. We were all on the same page as to what the lawmakers authoring the bill were clear in their intentions. So here's my take on this. If Van Hollen is actually trying to redefine what will count as a permit standard, he's overstepping his authority. He is trumping the clear intentions of Wisconsin lawmakers. Wisconsin lawmakers made it clear. So what they did is they took Florida's permit rules, which are a very basic framework, the minimum for permitting. Wisconsin lawmakers that were building our law took Florida's idea, said we like these basic requirements for a permit process, and we used them. No live fire requirement was ever mandated by the legislature. No 8-hour minimum was ever mandated by the legislature. And the authors of the Wisconsin Concealed Carry Bill intentionally went with bare minimums. They didn't want to require a bunch of long courses. They didn't feel they needed to require live fire requirements. And my point is, the very intent of the legislature was to have minimum requirements for permitting. So who the hell is J.B. Van Hollen to step in now and say, oh, I think it needs to be more detailed and more explicit and beefier, and we need live fire of this, and we need an 8-hour requirement? If Van Hollen is in fact doing this, he's clearly off on his own, inventing things. And I underline if. I have a hard time believing that Van Hollen is going to be this far off the reservation. This bill, as it was passed, was specific in what lawmakers would allow for. Current and former military members will be exempt from classes. People who had taken hunter safety courses in Wisconsin would be covered or grandfathered in. People who had taken safety courses and qualified to conceal carry in other states, we were told, would be covered. If you had a state of Utah carry permit, you'd be covered. If you had a state of Florida permit, you'd be covered, we were told. and that caused a lot of us, myself included, to go out and take courses to get permitted in Utah. I took a 4-hour course. I've got a Utah carry permit in my wallet already. That course did not include live fire training. So if J.B. Van Hollen now somehow mandates that and that stands, I'm going to have to go back and do some additional training. But how can Van Hollen just on his own decide what any Wisconsin permit now needs to be? Lawmakers who passed this made it quite clear. We do not feel the need to require live fire training. We do not feel the need to require 8-hour, 10-hour, 16-hour classes. They made it clear what their intent was. The authors of this bill and the people that vote on it knew what they were voting on. So how could Van Hollen or Scott Walker just invent other stuff now?